Dr. Tiera Tanksley, you were selected as one of 100 brilliant women in AI ethics in 2024. You're also a 2024 MacArthur and Op-Ed Public Voices Fellow focused on technology and the public interest. And you're here at UC Berkeley from your academic home at UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. And you just gave this amazing address for our 26th annual Berkeley Student Research Day program. And graciously, you've also joined us for a conversation on our podcast, Equity Leadership Now. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I was at your presentation and I was really impressed with how your work is continually evolving because, as you know, we had an opportunity to do a webinar with you almost exactly a year ago in one of our 21 CSLA regional academies. But what we didn't get in that webinar, and you gave us a little bit of it in today's presentation, is your own origin story. Can you start by telling us what's inspired you to do this kind of research and your own origin story and moving toward this research agenda?
Yeah, I was always a tech kid and a STEMmy kid. So when I was younger, I think I mentioned in the keynote that my dad was a computer scientist. So we had all kinds of technologies in the home. And so I got to tinker with tools, starting at 5 years old. I loved my STEM classes. My AP bio class was like one of my favorites. And I just always was interested in science and technology. So I actually was accepted into my undergraduate program as a biomed major. However, my classes were so hostile that even though my grades were great, I was just like, I don't see myself in STEM. Like, I don't want to have to live the rest of my life being beaten down, right, by my white male colleagues who are critiquing and doubting everything I'm saying, right? And so essentially I was counseled out of STEM major, and so I did a STEM minor and I focused on education. Then I also did another concentration in African American studies. And so we have this interesting pivot, right, where I'm now like, you know what, I love education. I've been tutoring my whole life, literally since I was in second grade. There was just so much hope in education, and especially in my African American studies courses, that I was like, I want to change schools. I want to bring STEM to young people in a way that they can see themselves in it and we can design different systems. And then eventually somehow, so I gave up on STEM and I was like, I'll be a science educator. I won't be a technologist. And then I went to UCLA and that's where I ended up meeting Safia and in some way landed back into technology, right? Studying technology and being, I guess, in STEM spaces. And so even though I guess in some way that got pushed out, I hacked my way back in. That's kind of the zigzag pathway that I got to this research. There's also this component of, I was very young doing my PhD. And so at the time, Black Lives Matter was really popular. And I myself was engaging in hashtag activism. And I was curious about what Black folks were experiencing when they got online, right? And they were seeing images of Black people dead and dying. So that was my entry point into learning about algorithms. It went from kind of my general interest about technology and race and education to how do these systems actually work? And how are they impacting young people in terms of their academic experiences, their socio-emotional experiences, even their like carceral entanglements, right? And so that's when I started to actually uncover how these systems, these socio-technical systems, hyper-circulate images of Black death and dying. And this is not accidental, right? Like it was actually designed that way. So that was kind of my launching off point into really getting into information sciences. And then I'll add one last piece because now that I can look back, hindsight is 2020, I see how all these things came together. When I was in undergraduate, I was very fiery. Okay. You can probably still see elements of that. But when
the fire hasn't burned out
at all. It's a little bit tamer now. But when I was younger, I was very radical. I was very mouthy. All the, good thing. My grandmother called me militant.
Oh, no.
Which I took as a compliment.
She was pretty militant herself.
Okay, right. So in one of my education classes, I had essentially like a really racist interaction with one of my educators, and it just kept happening. But I would always talk back and speak truth to power, right? And she told me to stop talking, and I was like, no. And eventually, I think I wore her down. wore her out, and so she quit randomly. And she was a TA. So then what ended up happening was our professor for the lecture hall actually had to take over the TA-ship. And he showed up and he said, "Which one of y'all is Tiera?" And I was like, "Me." And he was like, "You know what? I just got my PhD from UCLA's Graduate School of Education. You need to go there. You will thrive there."
Wow.
So he wrote my letter of rec, and that's how I ended up at UCLA. So somebody saw my resistance and my fire as something that was powerful, right? And so that final piece of the puzzle of I look at education, race, technology, but also resistance, right? Being that student who is questioning power. All of that came together to form my research agenda today.
I think you've coined something that as researchers in the academy, we can use as a mantra, and that's talk back. And the whole idea that there is a discourse and we are situated in that discourse on the margins. And this is not just critical race theory in terms of, powerful discourses, critiquing, dominant discourses, et cetera. I mean, that's actually out of James G's discourse theory, but we do have in critical race theory the notion of, critical storytelling and things like that. But talk back is short. And it means so much. It's like you unpeel that onion, and it's like all of the discourse that we could do in our career could be under the umbrella of talk back.
Yeah, talking back.
Yeah.
So Bell Hooks has a book, and it's called Talking Back, and I can't remember the subtitle, but the reason I love this term is because as a little black girl, I was in trouble all the time for talking back, right? Because you got too big for your britches, right? You got to stay out of grown folks' business. All of those phrases that you're very familiar with, I'm sure. And so oftentimes talking back was positioned as something that was problematic, but also dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Like if you talked back to power, there's a lot of repercussions that could happen, not necessarily just in, your household. Maybe you got in trouble and, you got put in timeout, whatever. But on the streets, there's also a danger, right? You talk back to the police and there can be, fatal responses. And so as a little girl, I understood that there was something inherently powerful and agentic about talking back, especially from like a black girl body.
Yeah.
It's really important to have that linguistic power, and know that it's telling these stories from the margin and like speaking truth to power that actually starts to shift things.
So let's begin by talking a little bit about AI ethics in education, because that's one of the entry points. So how would you define AI ethics, and particularly focusing on education?
Ethics, it's such a broad term when I think about it from the margins, right? So in work with my youth, my young people, they're like 16, 17-year-olds, I ask them that question. I said, how would you define, now that you've taken this 5-week course and you've learned all of the horrible ways that anti-blackness has manifested in AI, how do you define an ethical technology? And they gave a couple of tenets that I'll reiterate because, again, they're the experts, I think. So they mentioned that the technology needs to basically have a reciprocal relationship to the community. What are we getting from the tool? The tool can't just be extractive. It can't be stealing our data, right? It needs to actually be built in order to primarily help us. They also talk about having race-conscious and justice-oriented infrastructures, right? So rather than designing the tool based on hegemonic thinking, how do we actually change the logic models, the machine learning models, the algorithms, the code to actually be counter-hegemonic and race-conscious? Because right now it's post-racial, and that just means reiterating white supremacy. What are some of the other tenets? They feel like the tool needs to be designed by and for the community, right? Having someone just randomly make a tool and say, okay, schools can do it, right? Because oftentimes what they found in their own research was that the tools made for our schools are not often made by learning scientists or educational researchers or teachers or students, right? It's really no one's input who's involved in the educational community. And it's often folks from Silicon Valley who remember their schooling experience and they think, okay, well, I have the expertise because I experienced school myself and I'm going to design a technology that way. And so they are pushing back on that and saying that if we want to have an ethical tool in our school, it needs to be co-designed with members of our school community.
You made an excellent point earlier about the idea that people who don't necessarily understand what schooling is really about are often the ones designing the technology that we're attempting to engage in the schools. I think even teachers need to begin to say, if we're going to utilize different aspects of technology, how do I participate in the design to achieve the pedagogical ends that I have, so that you begin to shift from a person who has nothing other than the financial advantage of the AI tool. Can you talk a little bit about the roles that you see educational leaders playing in engaging AI in school?
I was just asked by an educator this same question last week, and they kind of positioned this question in, everything that you're saying is really moving. I don't argue with it. I understand it. But at the end of the day, we got to teach kids AI. The AI is here. We can't just resist it, so all of this is good to know. But on the ground, I don't feel like there's any hope. And my response to that was, that's actually the myth that they're telling you. That is the myth of white supremacy, but also of big AI, right? We are constantly told that the future is settled. Actually, Dr. Tressie McMillan-Cottom said that big AI's whole thing is constructing this narrative that resistance is futile, right? And that the future is settled, and we have no option. We just have to go forth, right, into this abysmal future. And she goes, when people say that, it actually means that the future is inherently unsettled, right? They're trying to convince you to not resist it because they actually can't do it without you opting in. It created this really rich conversation in the room amongst other educational leaders of actually we actually could just block this, right? If big AI is talking about education as the final frontier, which they are, right? And they're losing profits in every other industry, but they see education as the one industry that if they tap into it, they have profits into the future, right? Because once you ingrain the technology into schools, you know that it's changes the infrastructure, right? We start to build schools around the AI industry, right? As we have before. And so it's almost like we hold the power, because if it's unable to enter schools in the ways that they want it to enter schools, they don't actually have a leg to stand on, right? One, understand your power, that you can actually collectively resist these tools. Second of all, I think it's important for leaders to know that this is an AI hype bubble, right? And the bubble is actually bursting right now. And so as terrifying as, and as powerless as we feel, there's actually a ton, this is the moment to actually speak back and raise awareness. We see their profits are falling. We see a lot of people waking up to the environmental costs. And I just think if we all really are clear about what we're willing to have in our schools and what we're willing to do with our students, maybe that's going to push them to either redesign these tools or it's going to give space for other technologies to emerge that are actually beneficial to our students.
Or we have to reframe how the technology comes into schools.
There you
and it
go.
leads me into my next consideration. I know you've been influenced by Professor Rua Benjamin.
Yes.
What if these tools entered as abolitionist tools?
Okay, so what abolitionist technologies are? Essentially, what Ruha is showcasing in her work is that the technologies that are created by big AI, that's not the only way that technology can and should be developed, right? And so when you look at big AI, you can trace its roots directly to eugenics, right? All of the statistical algorithms that they use, chi-square, regression, correlation, those were all made by the founders of statistics, who are also the founders of eugenics, right? So what does it mean to start entirely different? And I think that's what abolitionist approaches to AI are going for. How do we design a technology that doesn't actually re-encode anti-Black sentiments, right, or classist sentiments, that actually is meant to perhaps provide more agency or protection for marginalized groups, that addresses problems identified by marginalized groups that would lead towards more just and joyous outcomes.
Let me enter there in terms of going a little bit further in terminology that you've been using. Talk a little bit about how these ways of thinking about it differently, how anti-Black outputs could be considered neither a bug or a glitch, for example.
Yeah. Our current technologies are foundationally anti-Black, right? And so I'm on this project that's trying to work with Black youth to understand what does an abolitionist robot look like? Is it possible to design an AI system that in and of itself is abolitionist, right? Which is interesting because can something that is fundamentally rooted in eugenics, can we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? What does this look like?
Can we use the master's tools to build our own house?
build
I
our
think
own
that's
house.
where the limit of the
Yeah.
metaphor is. But go ahead.
No, I agree. I love troubling that metaphor because I think it's a sentence taken out of
Context, yeah.
right. She said a lot of stuff. We're basically asking young people, right? Your school is bringing a robot in because they're all planning to bring robots in. We have these social robots that are coming in that are like teaching kids to essentially like cooperate with each other, which is just another form of like surveillance and control, right? The panopticon.
But I mean, it goes to another discussion we were having earlier about what is the role of social emotional learning in a digital context.
Yeah, the young people in my program have been thinking about, okay, if we were to have a robot in our school, A, I don't want it to be connected to law enforcement. B, I don't want it evaluating what I'm saying and seeing if I'm being a good helper in my small group. They said, I actually would love a robot that intervened in microaggressions, right? Because people believe technology and particularly robots are more trustworthy. And so in knowing that, the youth were like, what does it mean if the technology is telling my teacher who just microaggressed me that that was a microaggression? Can we develop a technology that helps us in our goals towards making schools more equitable?
So I have to ask you a little bit about how the evolution of the idea of robot is also tied to slavery and black bodies, et cetera,
Yes.
because the question of whether we can actually move from a concept of robot to being a person that's maybe an abolitionist tool when it has that history
Complicated.
is something that we have to decode.
Yes. So this is my new favorite topic.
Okay.
Is race and robots. I'm currently reading Tom Williams' book, who is my co-PI on the project. His book is called Degrees of Freedom, and it does the entire history of race and robots, right? The very first robot in the U.S. was designed to look like a black man, right? And this was Rostis, and he was called Rostis the Mechanical Robot, Rostis the Mechanical Negro, Rostis the Mechanical Slave.
Wow.
And I remind my students that robota, the etymology of the word, robot, means slave. When we're thinking about abolitionist robotics, abolition, the etymology goes back to the Latin origins. It's abolere, which is to abolish, and then olere, which is to grow, right? And so in order for us to actually get towards this libertary future, we not only have to dismantle an anti-black death-making system, right? But we also have to try to reimagine and build something new. And so while the history of robotics is one rooted in this idea of reshackling black folks on the plantation, right? And we know that's what big AI is doing. When they have folks in Kenya cleaning the data for $2 an hour, when they have prisoners doing that, when they have children mining minerals for silicon to make their microchips. There was a saying I just saw that said, every Silicon Valley innovation is slavery reimagined, right? So all of that being said, that the original idea of a robot was to replace at least the physical interaction with black folks, but you're still interacting with black folks. So that's the whole scam of AI, honestly. It's how do we hide the racialized, classed, gendered labor that is actually required to make this system work. You have this white robot who's doing all of the cleaning and cooking, so all the things that you would have low-wage people of color doing. The people who are operating these robots, they're the people in Kenya, right?
Yeah.
And there's so many examples of AI tools that are all about being frictionless, and you don't even need to interact with the grumpy cashier or the worker who has no social security, and so they have to work at, But one thing I want to note is that the future that they're promising us right now, this utopian future, it is only for a certain group of people.
With the new generation, Gen Alpha, born in 2010 to 2025, a generation that was also born concurrently with the dropping of the touchscreen technology. So this ability of children to animate digital devices without having to have keyboarding dexterity and skills, something different is happening there. Do you have any insights about where we're going with this generation?
Yes, I think that the goal of big tech has been to de-skill the working class, but also the general population, right? They want the population to be less critical, less educated,
Yes.
and less able to fight back. And they see AI and technology as this as tool to make sure that that occurs, right? Because then when you're talking about the folks who become discarded, whose jobs are being replaced by AI, right? All of that is the future that they have in mind.
That's why you have all the censorship, you know.
There you go.
We can control what you read. And really, you don't need to read. Let us tell you
Let us
what to
summarize.
think.
Let ChatGPT summarize this article for you, right? But we know, just like Paulo Freire said, right? Being able to read the text is about reading the world too, right? And there's some type of resistance. And even as a Black person who's a descendant of slaves, right? I know the power of literacy.
Yeah.
It is key to liberation. Not only have they come out with studies that show that using ChatGPT actually reduces your critical thinking, but they have actually said that the goal is to outsource your intelligence, right?
Yeah, you talked also about that actually being African intelligence. Another way to do the AI with the Kenyans having to do all of the scrubbing and things like that, that it doesn't exist without the labor force somewhere.
Exactly.
And that the labor force can be made invisible.
Yep.
I just want to pursue a little bit more of Professor Benjamin's notion of minor decisions and habits that can spread virally and have exponential positive effects. In your work, have you seen ways that small choices, small decisions can inform the way we think about and work on transforming these issues in society?
So I think one of the concerns that students of all ages that I've met with have experienced, they've said they feel overwhelmed by the problem. It's so big. So nothing I can do is going to actually make a difference. And this is where that idea of these small ruptures, I think, give us critical hope, because you don't have to dismantle the entire system today, right? How do we begin to chip away at that system? One of the myths of white supremacy is that you have to do everything individually, right? And that's what AI is trying to get us to do, right? Just you and that chatbot, right? Why ask anybody else? But in this notion of viral justice, it recenters human connection and says that rather than Google it, go and ask your friend, go and ask an elder, right? Have these human connections, raise consciousness in this way. And also, how can you help your neighbor? We're seeing this happen in Minnesota, right? With folks delivering food to each other and like providing shelter for each other. That is viral justice, right? And that grassroots movement has ballooned. It's empowering to know that A, I don't have to do this by myself, and B, I don't have to have all the answers, that I can actually start resisting today. There's a movement right now called Quit GPT, and it's gaining traction, right? I think even using different browsers, I mentioned Ecosia.
I have a better name. Don't chat with GPT.
Please don't.
Talk back instead.
No, I'm just but there's all of these ways. I mean, I just think we're not powerless, right? Like we can actually push back and talk back, and it's essential, right? Tell somebody else about what you learned about environmental consequences in AI. I find that every time I bring up one of these counterfacts outside of just me and ChatGPT talking, oh, ChatGPT writes my emails. But when I start talking about, well, you know about the Kenyan laborers? Or do you know about the people who are making the AI have talked about this as eugenics?
You may have prefigured my final question for you, but you talked about critical hope a little bit already. What keeps you hopeful in these tumultuous times?
So much. I think one, being with young people, because they are just filled with hope, right? I think that they are hackers and they find ways to like dismantle these systems and like talk back on social media. Like, I'll give an example. We know that there's a lot of suppression, algorithmic suppression happening on social media. And so the young people were noticing that their posts about Black issues were being suppressed. And so what they realized was that, okay, well, we live in a capitalist environment where anything about selling things is going to go viral. So instead of saying things like Black Lives Matter or we need to talk about the data centers that are harming Black communities, they started actually saying things like, I bought these jeans at Amazon and the link is below, but then they would have cards that actually read, Tennessee has a data center that is actually killing its residents, right? And just by having rhetoric that seems to a basic AI system that it's about capitalism, it goes viral, right? So just these small ways of like playing around and tweaking the algorithm, I think gives hope and shows that these systems are fallible.
I call it marketing Black consciousness, but it means figuring out what works in the market and then figuring out how the aspects of what you want to defend or promote as blackness can be fit into these, containers that already exist.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to share with us before we conclude?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to go back to what really keeps me motivated is, again, as a descendant of slaves, I come from a long lineage of people who fought back, regardless of if it seemed possible, right? It was this like reckless, audacious hope. And that is very much in my bones. We talk about epigenetics and how, you can inherit trauma, right?
Yes.
From
Generational
slavery.
trauma,
Yes. And I think you can also inherit intergenerational hope and resistance. And so I very much feel like I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. I'm part of that legacy. And knowing that they could dismantle that system and produce all of the Black joy and liberation that I'm able to be a part of today tells me that anything is possible. And I can absolutely keep carrying that legacy forward.
Dr. Tiera Tanksley from UCLA, and all of this amazing leadership in the area of, AI and the ways that we can reframe, talk back. Thank you so much for communicating with us on Equity Leadership Now.
Of course. Thanks for having me.